That morning, the business class flight from Portland to Boston departed as usual. The cabin was dimly lit, suitcases rolled gently, the scent of fresh coffee wafted through the air, but within minutes, a Skylinks Air first-class cabin became the stage for one of those small, system-shattering moments. A middle-aged woman, elegant and confident, took the first two seats, spread out blankets as if in a private room. And when the last passenger boarded a black man in a dark blue suit, elegant and calm, she looked at him coldly and said, "You must be mistaken. Someone like me doesn't sit next to that kind of person." Unknown to anyone in the cabin, the man was Malcolm Grant, CEO of the airline's parent company, a man who, with the push of a button, could bring the entire airline system to a halt. But what makes the world bow its head is not your power, but it is the way you choose to stay silent, letting your dignity speak instead of your anger. A reversal of power begins where arrogance is exposed, and justice steps out in its most serene form. If you believe that true justice does not require shouting, please like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to join me in the true story of silent justice. The morning sun hadn't fully lifted over Portland when Skylinks Air Flight 47201 began boarding for Boston. Inside the business class cabin, everything smelled of brewed coffee and quiet ambition. Suits rustled, screens glowed, and briefcases clicked shut like tiny declarations of power. The passengers were all the same kind of people, men and women who lived between airports, who thought in quarterly reports and market movements. They nodded without smiling, adjusted their watches to Eastern Time before the plane even left the ground. In seat 1D, and technically also 1E, sat Victoria Langston. Victoria had boarded early, wrapped in a cream cashmere shawl that looked as if it had never met a wrinkle in its life. Her jewelry didn't jingle. It whispered. The flight attendant had offered to hang her coat. She declined. Some people didn't surrender anything they didn't have to. The cabin crew had seen her before. Skylinks had regulars like her donors, investors, priority tier passengers. They were the kind of people who could make you question your own authority just by raising an eyebrow. Victoria placed her designer tote in 1D. Her purse in 1E spread a soft gray blanket across both seats, then carefully arranged a pillow by the window. It looked less like a travel setup and more like she was staging a private suite. When a young attendant named Sarah approached, her tone was polite but firm. "Langston, I'm sorry, but 1E is assigned to another passenger. May I help you adjust?" Victoria didn't even glance up. "I'm aware," she said, smooth as silk. "I requested space for medical reasons. Claustrophobia." Sarah hesitated. She had read the passenger manifest. There was no medical note. But there was that tone, that confident tilt of voice that made every correction sound like an inconvenience. Victoria smiled faintly, as if granting mercy. "Don't worry, dear. It's only a short flight. Whoever's assigned can sit elsewhere. I'm sure your system can handle that." Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again. She'd seen that kind of confidence before, the kind that didn't argue, because it didn't believe it could ever be wrong. From the galley, another attendant caught her eye. "Let it go." The look said, "Not worth it." Sarah adjusted her scarf, nodded once, and moved on. For the next 10 minutes, the cabin filled with the low hum of efficiency. Laptop lids rose, headphones clicked on. The metallic voice of pre-flight announcements floated through the air like background static. Victoria reclined slightly, pulled the blanket higher. The seatbelt sign chimed softly. Ignored. She scrolled through her phone, smiling at the news ticker Helios Aviation Group stock surges ahead of quarterly report. She didn't know, couldn't know, how ironic that headline would soon become. Across the aisle, an older man, gray suit, quiet eyes watched her behavior with mild disapproval. He didn't speak, but his look lingered long enough to make her uncomfortable. She turned her head toward the window. There's something about morning flights that strips away pretense. Under fluorescent light, everyone looks a little more human, but not Victoria. She carried her confidence like armor. I remember thinking this woman believes the cabin bends around her. It wasn't judgment. It was observation, the kind you make when you've seen the same story play out too many times. Someone mistaking privilege for proof of importance. From the cockpit, the captain's voice crackled, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're just waiting for final boarding. Should be on our way shortly." That was when the stillness began to shift. Down the aisle, near the curtain separating first class from the rest, a tall man appeared, broad shoulders, navy suit, calm eyes, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. He glanced at his ticket, then at the row numbers. But that moment, the one when he stood there quietly, looking toward seat 1E, hadn't happened yet in the story the others were living. Right now, there was only Victoria, the extra seat, and the silence of people who'd learned it was safer not to interfere. Back in row 3, 2 businessmen whispered about market trends. One of them mentioned a name, Malcolm Grant, the Helios guy. The other nodded, impressed. They had no idea that the name they said so casually would soon redefine what this flight meant. For now, Skylink's 4721 remained a world in miniature, polished, hierarchical, and unaware that its own hierarchy was about to turn on itself. A flight attendant checked the manifest one last time. Her tablet glowed faintly. Seat 1E, occupied unauthorized. She frowned, tapped twice, and sighed. The air conditioning hummed louder, or maybe it only felt that way because the tension had begun to thicken. Victoria closed her eyes, took a slow breath as if preparing for meditation. In her mind, the flight had already begun. The world outside the window, the one filled with people who didn't belong in her row, was no longer relevant. She pressed the call button once, gently. Sarah returned, professional smile reattached. "Yes, Ms. Langston. Would you mind bringing me some sparkling water before takeoff room temperature? Please. And could you make sure no one disturbs this seat?" Her hand touched the blanket draped across 1E. Sarah hesitated again. "I'll see what I can do." As the attendant walked away, Victoria reached for her phone again, typing something, perhaps a message, perhaps just to look busy. Her reflection in the dark screen stared back at her, elegant and composed, a woman who always got her way. Outside, the sky was clearing. The light bled slowly through the oval windows, painting everything in pale gold. Inside, a story was setting itself up quietly, almost politely. No one knew yet that a single unclaimed seat would soon become a moral battleground. No one imagined that the man who would take that seat had the power to ground not just a plane, but an entire system. For now, the engines were idle, the cabin calm, and Victoria Langston ruled her 2 seats as if they were a kingdom no one dared to question. Somewhere deep inside the hum of the aircraft, a system blinked ready, waiting, And if I had known then what I know now, I would have seen it as the sound of something ancient breaking the illusion that comfort can buy dignity, or that money can assign worth. The seat next to her remained empty, but not for long. The boarding door hissed shut. The sound was soft, but it felt final, like a stage curtain closing before the first act began. The last passenger stepped through. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, with skin the color of dark oak polished by time. His suit navy, perfectly fitted, didn't shout money, but whispered precision. Everything about him was quiet. His gait, his eyes, even the way he held his boarding pass steady, measured, exact. Malcolm Grant. To the crew, he was just another late arrival. To the world outside that cabin, he was the architect of the very system keeping this plane in the air. But in that moment, none of them knew. He paused at row 1. His gaze rested on the seat marked 1E. The seat wasn't empty. It was occupied by a gray blanket, a designer tote, and a woman pretending not to notice him. Victoria Langston. She scrolled through her phone, one manicured finger sliding across the screen as if the presence beside her didn't exist. "Excuse me," Malcolm said, his tone calm, almost gentle. "I believe this is my seat." He showed his ticket. The printed text was unmistakable 1E, business class. Victoria looked up slowly, a smile forming polite, performative. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, voice dipped in condescension. "There must be some mistake." Her eyes flicked to the boarding pass, then to him, then back again. "That's strange. I'm sure they don't usually assign these seats twice." Malcolm didn't move. He wasn't offended, not yet. He'd seen this scene before, in airports, in meetings, in rooms where he had to prove he belonged. "I'm certain this is the right seat," he replied. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Victoria gave a soft, breathy laugh. "I think you're mistaken, sir. This seat's been arranged for medical reasons. Maybe check with the flight attendants from 2 rows back." Someone lowered their newspaper. A few heads turned. Small things ripple quickly in small spaces. The attendant, Sarah, approached again, tablet in hand. Her face tightened when she recognized both passengers. "Ms. Langston," she began carefully, "your seat is 1D. Mr. Grant's seat is 1E. Victoria tilted her head, as though processing foreign information. Then, with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything in her life, she said, "Well, I'm not moving. I already explained I have a condition. Claustrophobia. The extra space helps." Sarah tried again. "I understand, but this flight is full." Victoria's voice sharpened. "Then fix it. Isn't that your job?" There was no shouting, no chaos, just a silence so thick it felt like static. Malcolm stood still, eyes calm, posture straight. He didn't interrupt. That restraint, the way he held himself, made the tension feel heavier. "I'd be happy to switch," he said, finally, "if there's another seat available." Sarah shook her head softly. "I'm afraid there isn't, sir." That was when Victoria leaned back, smiled at him as though indulging a child. "I'm sure Coach is comfortable enough. They have wider aisles now, don't they?" The words hung in the air like a drop of cold water. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I remember that moment, the way the air changed. You could feel everyone silently calculating whether to look away or pretend nothing had happened. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her one slow, level glance that made the smile falter for half a second. "I'll wait for the crew to resolve it," he said. His tone was still soft, almost neutral, but there was something beneath it, something grounded and immovable. He stepped aside, into the narrow space near the bulkhead. Sarah followed, apologizing under her breath. Victoria exhaled, satisfied. She tucked the blanket closer, as though reclaiming territory. Across the aisle, the man in 2A whispered to his seatmate. A woman behind them lifted her phone, recording discreetly. The quiet was no longer peaceful, it was brittle. Sarah returned to the galley to call the purser. She spoke quickly, low-voiced. Words like medical claim, overlap, and sensitive filtered through. Malcolm waited. He didn't check his watch. He didn't pace. He just stood there, still as stone, while the system tried to decide whether his dignity was worth disturbing a passenger with status. Victoria adjusted her eye mask and reclined again, muttering something about people who make scenes. I thought then she believes the rules bend for her because they always have. In the front galley, Olivia Reed, the purser, joined Sarah. Olivia was composed, practiced the kind of woman who'd diffused dozens of small fires in her career, but when she saw the seating chart, she frowned. 1E belongs to Mr. Grant, she said. Confirmed in the manifest. There's no medical request on record. Sarah nodded. She says she feels unsafe sitting next to him. Olivia paused. Unsafe. She implied it, Sarah whispered. Didn't say it outright, but Olivia took a slow breath. All right, I'll handle it. Back in the cabin. Victoria was already mid-sentence when Olivia arrived. I understand you're feeling uncomfortable, Olivia began, her tone neutral. I am, Victoria said quickly. That man, he made me feel uneasy. I don't think I can sit here. The way she said that man, as if he were an inconvenience, not a person made something inside the cabin shift again. Malcolm didn't speak. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence was louder than any argument. Olivia stood there, caught between policy and perception. She glanced at Malcolm, calm, patient, unflinching, and then at Victoria, whose confidence had begun to edge into hysteria. I'll ask the captain to hold departure, Olivia said. Victoria nodded, triumphant. Good. I'll need this resolved before we go anywhere. From the rear of the cabin, someone muttered, You've got to be kidding. Phones came up again. Red recording lights blinked. Olivia gestured for Malcolm to step aside, toward the galley. Sir, just for a moment, please. He followed, wordless. His footsteps were measured, deliberate. He stopped near the beverage cart and folded his hands lightly in front of him. From there, he could still see the cabin, the passengers whispering. Victoria, smiling faintly. Victorious. The flight attendants exchanging uneasy looks. He didn't sigh, didn't roll his eyes. He simply watched, observed. He knew how these moments worked the way people's true selves surfaced when they believed they had power. 7 minutes. That's what he gave them. 7 minutes to see themselves. I didn't know it then, but those 7 minutes would change everything, not just for the people on that flight, but for the company that carried them, the policies that protected them, and the illusion that dignity could ever be optional. Back in row 1, Victoria lifted her glass of sparkling water, took a slow sip, and smiled. She believed she'd won. The engines remained silent. The jet didn't move. But somewhere, a quiet pulse of authority began to stir unseen, patient, and far greater than anyone in that cabin could imagine. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise or fury. Sometimes it begins with a man choosing not to sit, and a world forced to watch what that silence means. The cabin had gone quiet again, that kind of quiet that hums where everyone hears everything but pretends they don't. The engines were still idle, and the air felt heavier, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. Olivia Reed, the lead flight attendant, stood at the front, tablet in hand, posture crisp but unsure. Her training had prepared her for turbulence, not this kind. She double-checked the screen again. Seat 1E Grant. Malcolm, confirmed. Seat 1D Langston, Victoria. No double booking, no mistake. She looked up, scanning the cabin. Victoria sat there like a queen waiting for her tea, chin high, eyes expectant. Malcolm stood near the galley, calm, composed, the very picture of restraint. Olivia approached. She lowered her voice. "Ms. Langston, I've verified our records. Seat 1E belongs to Mr. Grant. I'm afraid we'll need you to move your things." For a heartbeat, nothing. Then Victoria turned toward her, eyes wide, a tremor in her voice that felt rehearsed. "Are you serious?" "Yes, ma'am," Olivia said softly. Victoria's lips tightened. She looked around the cabin, an audience she hadn't realized she'd gained. Cameras were out now, small red dots glinting between seats. Then came the shift, the tone. Her voice softened, but her words sharpened. I don't feel safe sitting next to him." The words were simple, but they cut through the cabin like pressure through glass. Olivia blinked. "I'm sorry." Victoria took a shallow breath, performing fragility. "It's nothing he did," she said quickly. "It's just he was standing over me, and it was intimidating. I have anxiety. I don't feel safe." There it was, the oldest trick in the book. The "I feel unsafe" card. It never needed evidence, just tone. And for too long, tone had been enough. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone muttered, "Are you serious?" Another whispered, "Unbelievable." Phones lifted higher. A couple in row 3 exchanged a look that said more than words could. Malcolm said nothing. He simply stood where he was, hands loosely clasped, face calm. I remember thinking if Serenity had a face, it would have looked like his. Olivia swallowed hard. She could feel her crew's eyes on her, waiting for direction. There were rules, yes, but there was also optics. One wrong call, and this could spiral beyond the cabin. "Mr. Grant," she said quietly, "if you could just wait in the galley for a few minutes while we sort this out." He met her gaze. No anger, no accusation, just the faintest nod. "Of course," he said. "That's all." 2 words. And somehow, that calm made everyone else look smaller. He stepped aside, walking past Victoria without a word. The aisle seemed narrower as he moved, not because of his size, but because of what he carried: composure, where anyone else might have carried fury. Victoria exhaled, leaning back into her seat. "There," she said softly, almost to herself. "That's better." She adjusted her blanket, rearranged her pillow, and for the first time in 20 minutes smiled. A smile of victory. Across the aisle, a man in a gray suit shook his head. "Better for who?" he muttered under his breath. Olivia caught it, but didn't respond. She turned back toward the galley, where Malcolm stood quietly near the service cart, looking out the small window into the morning light. He wasn't checking his phone, wasn't pacing, just waiting. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir." Olivia began carefully. He nodded once. "You're just doing your job. But she could tell it wasn't reassurance, it was grace, the kind that forgives you before you even realize you need it. For a moment, she thought of her own son, 21, tall, soft-spoken, the same calm in his eyes, and the thought hit her like turbulence if it were him, standing here, being asked to move because someone felt unsafe. What would I do? She looked away. The silence between them stretched, filled with all the things that shouldn't have needed to be said. Back in seat 1D, Victoria reached for her phone. She opened her camera app, adjusted her hair, and began recording herself quietly, framing her expression in a mix of indignation and fear. She whispered something like, "Just documenting, for my protection." The passengers around her shifted uncomfortably. One woman rolled her eyes, another leaned over to her husband and whispered. That man didn't even raise his voice, but Victoria didn't notice. She was building her narrative, one breathless sigh at a time. Malcolm, in the galley, remained silent. The hum of the cabin pressurization filled the space around him, steady, rhythmic. He looked down at his watch, then at the reflection of the cabin door in the polished metal wall. 7 minutes. That's what he gave them, 7 minutes to reveal who they were. The longer you stay silent, the more truth the world supplies on its own. I remember that line passing through my mind like a whisper. Up front. Olivia returned to her crew station. "Hold boarding clearance," she said into her mic. "We're not moving yet." The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Copy that. Reason passenger dispute in first class." Olivia replied. A pause, then resolved soon. She didn't answer. Because how do you resolve a feeling someone invents to justify their comfort? The other passengers began to stir. Someone in row 4 stood to stretch and muttered, "Ridiculous." Another said, "He should sue." Victoria heard them. Her face flushed for a second, then hardened again, back into the porcelain of entitlement. She turned toward the galley and raised her voice just enough. "I don't appreciate being made to feel unsafe. I have rights, too." Nobody replied. Malcolm didn't look up. He didn't flinch. But Olivia did. Because that sentence, "I have rights," too, had always been the final shield for people like Victoria when the mirror turned on them. From the galley window, sunlight flickered off the wing. Outside, the tarmac shimmered in early heat. Inside, everything remained still. Victoria scrolled through her messages, perhaps expecting sympathy, perhaps already planning a complaint email to corporate. She believed she'd won, but victories built on fear never last long. For now, she sat upright, wrapped in her soft blanket, the queen of a shrinking kingdom. Malcolm waited, and the plane, suspended between ground and sky, seemed to wait with him as if justice itself was holding its breath, deciding which way to fall. The cabin remained frozen in that strange, pressurized silence, the kind that hums louder than noise. From her seat, Victoria Langston had reclined just enough to declare comfort, one hand resting on the blanket she'd used as a flag of territory. In her mind, the scene was over. She had won, but in the galley, just steps away. Malcolm Grant was timing the world. He stood by the stainless steel counter, calm, still, expression unreadable. The hum of the refrigeration unit filled the air. A clock on the wall ticked. He looked down at his watch, a slim, simple piece of engineering. Not expensive looking, but precise. 7 minutes. That's what he gave them. 7 minutes to show him who they really were. Nobody on board knew who he was. Not the passengers with their tailored suits and subtle arrogance, not the crew who whispered nervously about procedure and policy, and certainly not Victoria, who now scrolled through her phone, thinking of the story she'd tell later how she handled the situation gracefully. What she couldn't have known was that the man she'd just displaced was the founder and CEO of Helios Aviation Group, the parent company of Skylinks Air, the very airline she believed existed to serve her whims. Malcolm didn't need to remind anyone of that fact. He preferred to watch systems reveal themselves. You learn more from what people do when they think you're powerless than from what they say when they know you're not. He leaned slightly against the galley wall, eyes fixed on the aisle. Sarah, the junior attendant, passed by nervously, pretending to check inventory. He offered her a polite smile. She didn't know whether to return it. Down the narrow corridor, Olivia stood by the cockpit door, whispering with the captain. The word delay came through, followed by situation and first-class dispute. From the cockpit, Captain Holt's voice was measured but firm. Keep it contained, no escalation. We'll hold until resolved, contained. That's what they always said when they didn't understand the problem. You can't contain moral failure. It leaks. I remember thinking it's almost poetic, the way arrogance mistook silence for absence. Malcolm's phone vibrated softly in his pocket. A notification encrypted, discreet. He didn't look at it yet, not until the 7 minutes were up, outside the plane, on the tarmac. A ground supervisor was holding the pushback clearance, waiting on word from the cockpit. The delay would ripple through the network in minutes, a small disturbance now, a system-wide logjam later. Back in the cabin, Victoria was speaking again, this time to the man across the aisle. "I'm not a bad person," she said, tone defensive. "I just don't like feeling unsafe. You never know with people these days." The man didn't answer. He just stared at her, long enough for her to look away. Malcolm could hear her voice faintly from the galley. He didn't flinch, didn't respond. His silence wasn't weakness. It was containment, like gravity holding a storm in place. He finally checked his watch again. 5 minutes gone. He opened his phone and tapped twice on an icon most people would never see, Protocol Nova. It wasn't dramatic. No sound, no alert, just a silent handshake between his device and a network that spanned the continent. At Helios headquarters in Denver, lights flickered on across a glass-paneled operations floor. A systems analyst looked up at her screen. "Sir, we've got a priority one from Grant's ID. Naomi Clark, Director of Operation, across the room. Timestamp live," the analyst said. "Flight 4721, Skylinks." Naomi's expression didn't change. She'd been with Helios long enough to know what a Nova ping meant. "Don't intervene," she said. "Observation mode only, full telemetry, cabin audio, crew logs, across the network." Silent systems began recording behavior analytics, communication patterns, tone of voice mapping. The plane hadn't moved an inch, but the company's internal compass had just shifted. Back on board, Olivia approached the galley again. "Mr. Grant, thank you for your patience," she said softly. "The captain is reviewing the situation." He nodded. "I understand." She hesitated, studying him, the stillness, the steady eyes. Something about him didn't fit the narrative she'd been handed. Her instincts, sharpened by years of reading passengers, whispered that this man wasn't who she thought. "May I get you anything while you wait?" He smiled faintly. "Just clarity, Ms. Reed." That's all anyone really wants. Olivia didn't know what to say to that. She returned to the cabin, shoulders a little heavier. Victoria, seeing her come back, lifted her chin. "Is this resolved yet?" "Not yet, ma'am." "Well," Victoria sighed. "It should be. I've explained I don't feel safe. I don't know what more you need." Her voice had softened again, that performative fragility that made her look like the victim instead of the aggressor. And the camera phones around her drank it in. But the thing about being watched is that sometimes you don't know who's watching back. At Helios HQ, Naomi's team was already reviewing live cabin footage from the in-flight camera feed. It wasn't public knowledge that Skylink's business class had integrated behavioral tracking for safety analytics. Malcolm had designed it himself, years ago as a safeguard against abuse of authority, not just security threats. Now, those same systems were watching this exact moment. No raised voices from Malcolm, no gestures, no threat, just a man standing calmly while someone turned fear into a weapon. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sometimes the system you built to protect fairness becomes the only witness left when fairness disappears. 7 minutes. He checked the time again. The second hand hit the mark. He tapped his phone once more. At HQ. Naomi saw the shift. He's moving from observed to active protocol. "What does that mean?" one analyst asked. "It means," Naomi said quietly, "somebody on that plane is about to learn who they just humiliated." In the cabin, the air changed. Small details: the captain's door cracked open, the flight attendants whispering more urgently. Victoria noticed the subtle shift in energy. "What's going on?" she asked. Her voice edged with sudden uncertainty. No one answered. From the galley, Malcolm stepped forward just slightly, the soft lighting glinting off his watch. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even look her way. He just waited. Outside, the pushback team received an unexpected command. "Hold position. Await executive clearance." That command didn't come from the flight deck. It came from the corporate channel Helios Priority Override down in the galley. Malcolm's phone vibrated once more. He looked at it briefly, a simple message from Naomi Observation complete. System paused. Your call. He slid the phone back into his pocket. I remember that moment, the subtle gravity in his posture, the way time seemed to bend around his silence. It wasn't power in the loud, cinematic sense. It was quieter than that. He looked like a man simply reclaiming what had always been his. Victoria noticed the plane hadn't moved. She straightened in her seat, irritation flickering to unease. "Why aren't we taking off?" she asked, half to Olivia, half to herself. Olivia hesitated. "I'm not sure, ma'am." For the first time, Victoria looked uncertain. Her eyes darted to Malcolm, still standing near the galley. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He was simply watching. And in that silence, something in the air cracked. Because when the man you dismissed turns out to be the one holding the ground beneath you, the world rearranges itself quietly, completely. The plane was still, engines quiet, cabin lights low, the kind of stillness that feels temporary, like the moment before thunder decides to fall. Malcolm Grant stood in the galley, his hands resting lightly on the metal counter. His reflection in the polished surface looked back at him, calm, composed, patient. He didn't need to speak. Not yet. He slipped his phone from his pocket and, with a single press of his thumb, activated Protocol Nova. It was not dramatic, no alarms, no flickering lights, no cinematic flourish, Just a soft vibration, a digital whisper that traveled farther and faster than anyone in that cabin could imagine. Somewhere, 200 miles away, in a glass tower rising over downtown Denver, a small light blinked on inside the Helios Operations Center. At first, it was just another blip on a dashboard filled with thousands of data streams, flight telemetry, crew communication logs, fuel metrics. Then, the algorithm recognized the encrypted tag attached to the signal. Nova.Grant, Priority 1. The system didn't question the source. It couldn't. The founder's access was hard-coded into its foundation, written into the company's DNA like a signature hidden beneath every line of code. Inside the command floor, a voice cut through the hum of monitors. "Ma'am, we've just received a Nova ping." Naomi Clark, director of operations, turned from the glass wall that overlooked the city. Her expression didn't change, just her eyes. From WHO CEO's device, Flight 4721, Skylinks Air. She exhaled once, calm, controlled, observation mode only, engage full telemetry, record all behavior metrics. I want eyes on cockpit, cabin, and comms. No contact unless I say so. Her team moved without question. They knew the protocol. Nova was not for emergencies. It was for truth. For those rare moments when the system itself had to be watched not for malfunction, but for moral failure. Back in the air, the passengers of Flight 4721 had no idea they'd become the center of a silent audit. Inside the cabin, Victoria Langston still sat reclined in her seat, wrapped in her designer blanket. Her face glowed faintly from the reflection of her phone as she typed a message, maybe to a friend, maybe to no one at all. She looked calm, almost smug. She believed the plane was waiting on her comfort, not her consequence. Olivia Reed, at the front, stood beside the service area, exchanging uneasy glances with her crew. She didn't know why the pushback order hadn't come through. Flights didn't just stop. I remember watching that scene. Every detail crisp in memory, how ordinary it all looked. That's what makes injustice so sinister. It always starts by looking ordinary. Malcolm leaned slightly forward, glancing at his watch again. The second hand swept cleanly past the 7-minute mark. He'd given them their time. In Denver, Naomi's team had already switched the feed from passive to active observation. On her screen, multiple panes glowed: the cockpit, the galley, the cabin front. Each window carried a silent timestamp, updating in real time. Telemetry clean. A technician reported. Crew comms confirmed delay logged as passenger dispute. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. Who initiated the dispute? Passenger in 1D? Victoria Langston? Of course, Naomi murmured. Then tag behavioral analysis on all personnel in proximity, crew tone mapping, eye movement tracking, emotional bias detection. Across the floor, the system began to measure more than flight data. It measured character. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Raymond Holt adjusted his headset. He'd been told only that a dispute had delayed takeoff. He didn't yet know the name of the man standing quietly in his galley. "Let's keep the APU running," he said to his first officer. "Ground delay may extend." He was right. It would extend far beyond what he imagined. In the cabin, passengers whispered, "Isn't that the same guy she called unsafe?" "Yeah, he's just standing there. Hasn't said a word. Someone's filming. This is going online." Victoria heard them. Her back stiffened. "People are so dramatic," she muttered, half to herself. But, for the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. Something about the atmosphere had changed. The crew seemed distracted, not deferential. From the galley, Malcolm lifted his gaze slightly, noticing the shift in energy. The subtle clicks in the system, the way information began to move differently. He could almost feel it. His phone vibrated once. A message from Naomi. Just one line. "All eyes on you, sir." He smiled faintly, not pride, not satisfaction, just confirmation. At that exact moment, Naomi's team in Denver began a behavioral integrity scan, a real-time AI overlay that assessed tone, volume, and bias patterns in every voice transmission on the flight. Within seconds, the screen labeled the crew's internal communications, passenger in 1D claims safety concern. "But he hasn't done anything." "Yeah, but you know how this looks." The algorithm flagged the phrase, "You know how this looks?" Bias confirmed. Severity level 2. Naomi folded her arms. "Catalog that. Timestamp 0912. Continue monitoring." Below, on the tarmac, a message pinged to Skylinks' ground control flight 4721 operational hold. Review initiated. To most, it looked like a technical delay. To Helios HQ, it was an ethical freeze. In seat 1D, Victoria shifted uncomfortably. The longer the engine stayed silent, the more she sensed the shift she couldn't name. Olivia walked past her again, her professional smile thinner now. "Everything okay?" Ms. Langston Victoria tried to regain control. "I just don't understand why we're still here." "Can't you people make a decision?" Olivia paused, the words catching her slightly. "You people." She didn't respond, but her silence said everything. From the galley, Malcolm watched the small exchange. His expression didn't change, but I remember thinking he was memorizing every second of it. He checked his phone again. The display pulsed once. The Helios crest appeared. Then a confirmation Nova protocol engaged monitoring complete, awaiting executive discretion. He exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly. The work was done. Now the world would reveal itself. Inside the operations center, Naomi turned to her assistant. "Mark the crew for debriefing after landing. Send anonymized transcripts to compliance. No press, no leaks. We'll handle this internally first." The assistant nodded. "Understood. Do we notify the captain who's on board?" Naomi looked at the feed at Malcolm standing motionless near the galley door. "Not yet," she said quietly. "He prefers to watch before he speaks." And that was true. Malcolm Grant had built his empire on that philosophy that you don't correct the system by yelling at it. You correct it by making it see itself. From the outside, the delay still looked ordinary, just another morning glitch. But inside the heart of Helios, everything was in motion. Every system, every sensor, every line of communication was now tuned to one man's silence. And that silence, calm, deliberate, unflinching, had more power than any order he could give aloud. I remember thinking then, that's how real authority works. Not through noise, but through inevitability. In the cabin, Victoria shifted again. The hum beneath her seat had gone quiet. The warmth of self-importance began to cool. For the first time, she wondered who, exactly, she was waiting on. Malcolm checked his watch one last time, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. The system was awake now. The record was live, and while everyone else thought the flight had stalled, he knew the truth: it had just taken off. The air inside Skylinks Air Flight 4721 had changed. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it, a faint vibration beneath the calm. Something invisible had shifted. For nearly 20 minutes, the flight had sat motionless on the Portland tarmac. Passengers whispered theories, exchanged looks, checked watches. From row 3, a man in a charcoal blazer leaned toward his companion. "Do you know who that is?" he murmured. His friend frowned. "Who?" "The guy standing by the galley, the one they asked to move." "What about him?" "That's Malcolm Grant." The name hung between them like static. "The Helios guy?" "Yeah, founder, CEO, the parent company of Skylinks." The second man blinked, sat back slowly. "You're kidding." "I wish I was." The whisper spread quietly through the cabin from aisle to aisle, row to row. At first, people just looked. Then, one by one, they realized what that meant. The man they'd watched get displaced, dismissed, and politely exiled to the galley, the man who hadn't raised his voice once, was the architect of the very airline they were sitting on. In 1D. Victoria Langston didn't hear it at first. She was still scrolling her phone, irritated by the delay, muttering to herself. But the energy in the cabin had changed. The murmurs weren't about her anymore. They were about him. She finally looked up. The people around her weren't avoiding eye contact anymore. They were studying her, watching. Across the aisle, a woman whispered just loud enough she told him to go to Coach. Her husband replied, "To the CEO of Helios." Victoria's stomach tightened. For the first time, she glanced toward the galley, searching his face for a clue, some sign that this couldn't possibly be true. Malcolm was still there, calm. Still, his hands folded in front of him. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't even watching her. That made it worse. I remember thinking some silences weigh more than anger ever could. At the front, Olivia Reed caught the ripple of recognition, too. The whispers were spreading faster now. She tapped her comm to the cockpit. "Captain Holt, I think you should be aware." In the cockpit, Captain Raymond Holt was reviewing weather updates when the message came through. "Go ahead." "Sir, the passenger in 1E, the one we temporarily relocated, his name is Malcolm Grant." There was a pause. Not long, but enough. "The Malcolm Grant." "Yes, sir. CEO of Helios Aviation Group." Captain Holt turned his chair slightly toward his first officer, who looked up from the checklist, eyebrows raised. The captain's hand froze over the throttle switches. "Confirm that," he said. Olivia replied, "Confirmed, sir. Manifest matches corporate credentials." Holt leaned back slowly, exhaling. He stared out the windshield at the tarmac shimmering in the morning light. Then he reached forward and flipped a single switch, halting the pushback request. The ground crew blinked at the unexpected cancellation. "Skylinks 4-7-2-1 confirm, hold position affirmative," Holt said calmly. "We're pausing operations inside the cockpit." The first officer gave a low whistle. "What's the story?" Holt's reply was quiet but firm. "Looks like someone just told the man who owns the sky to move his seat." Back in the cabin, Olivia received confirmation from the cockpit. Her chest tightened slightly, though she kept her voice even. "Copy, Captain. Holding position." She turned to her crew. "Everyone, stay professional. No further interaction with the passenger in 1D until I say so." Sarah nodded, already understanding. But Victoria, oblivious to the full picture, leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said sharply, flagging Olivia with a flick of her hand. "Why are we not moving? Yet I have a connection in Boston." Olivia met her gaze, calm but distant. "We're under review. Ms. Langston, please remain seated." Victoria huffed. "Under review by who?" Olivia didn't answer. Victoria tried again, her voice rising slightly. You do realize I know people on the Skylinks board. I could have your job in a second." A few passengers turned their heads. One of them, a woman with silver hair, spoke quietly but firmly, "Ham, maybe it's time you stopped talking." That single sentence silenced her more effectively than any order could. In the galley, Malcolm remained motionless, but something subtle had shifted in his posture. Not arrogance, not satisfaction, just quiet control. He glanced at his phone. A new message from Naomi Clark appeared. "Naomi Clark, Helios HQ. Captain has been informed. All systems under silent audit. Awaiting your directive." He typed 3 words. "Proceed as observed." No one in the cabin could feel the network pulse that followed, how data streams aligned, how the headquarters systems recalibrated to record every interaction, every voice inflection. But Malcolm didn't need them to know. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked out the small galley window. The sunlight had shifted warmer now, golden, almost forgiving. Inside the cabin, the hierarchy was dissolving quietly. The man who'd been treated as a nuisance was, in truth, the axis upon which everyone else's employment turned. The woman who believed she could dictate comfort was now the only one visibly uncomfortable. And the crew who had acted out of fear were beginning to understand that fear had been misplaced. Olivia approached him carefully. "Mr. Grant, would you like to return to your seat?" He turned slightly toward her, expression neutral. "Not yet," he said softly. "Let's give everyone time to find their footing." She nodded. There was no order in his voice, but somehow it felt like one. Behind her, Victoria fidgeted with her blanket. "This is ridiculous," she whispered to no one. "It's just a misunderstanding." A man 2 rows back answered, almost kindly, "Maybe, but sometimes misunderstandings reveal everything." She looked away, color draining from her face. Olivia returned to the galley, lowering her voice. Captain confirmed recognition. Full hold in effect. Malcolm gave a small nod. "Good," he said. "That's all that's needed." He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The balance had already restored itself not through force, but through truth. I remember thinking the moment justice arrives, it doesn't shout. It simply changes the air pressure. The passengers could feel it now, an invisible recalibration. Every look, every whisper carried new awareness. Even those who'd stayed silent earlier now seemed uneasy with their own silence. In 1D, Victoria folded her arms, her earlier certainty unraveling. She kept glancing toward the galley, trying to gauge how much people knew, but it was too late. The story had shifted, and she wasn't its author anymore. When Malcolm finally moved, it was slow, unhurried. He stepped back into the aisle, the quiet authority of someone who didn't need permission. Olivia straightened instinctively. Sarah did too. He didn't speak to Victoria. He didn't have to. His calm presence alone made the truth undeniable. In the cockpit, Captain Holt's voice came over the intercom, low and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief operational delay. Please remain seated as we finalize internal review procedures." His phrasing was deliberate internal review. He knew exactly what was happening now. He turned to his first officer. "We're not pushing back until I get word from Denver." The first officer nodded. "That's above our pay grade. Isn't it?" Holt allowed himself the faintest smile. "Everyone's pay grade is below one man's today." Outside, the ground crew waited beside the idle jet, unaware that a quiet revolution was unfolding inside. Inside, The passengers had stopped whispering. The cabin had gone still again, not out of tension this time, but out of respect. Victoria sat rigid, eyes forward, the weight of every stare pressing into her back. Her confidence had evaporated, leaving only silence. Malcolm looked down the aisle once more, then at the reflection in the galley door, calm, unbroken, resolute. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The power had already shifted. For a long minute, nothing happened. The engines remained silent. The cabin still. Then, somewhere far from the tarmac of Portland International Airport in a high-rise tower in Denver, a decision was made. Inside the Helios Operations Command, the air was thick with quiet focus. Monitors lined the walls, each showing a different map of the skies, glowing arcs of movement that looked, from a distance, like constellations. At the center of it all stood Naomi Clark, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the stream marked Flight 4721. Status hold. Her voice was even almost calm. "Trigger a controlled slowdown," she said. A young systems engineer turned in his chair. "Ma'am, across which network?" "3 major hubs," Naomi replied. "Boston, Chicago, Atlanta. Make it look like a latency issue. Duration 7 minutes. No one questioned her. They all knew what that meant and who it was for. Within seconds, a cascade of commands rippled through the digital grid. To the untrained eye, it would appear as nothing more than a minor technical hiccup. To those who built the system, it was a quiet act of realignment, like tightening the strings of an instrument until harmony returned. Propagation, in effect, an analyst said. On the map, 3 soft amber lights blinked BOSS, ORD, ATL across the country. Flights idled on taxiways. Ground control issued vague explanations. Network sync issue. Please hold position. No one would trace it to Denver. They never did. I remember thinking it's almost poetic, how justice in the modern world travels through data instead of declarations. Back on Flight 4721, the passengers were starting to notice the tension. The hum of the cabin had shifted again, denser now, as if the air itself understood something was unraveling. Victoria Langston adjusted her blanket, trying to maintain composure. Her reflection in the seatback screen looked paler than before. "What's taken so long?" she muttered, half to herself, half to the air. Across the aisle, no one answered. People were watching her again, but not with curiosity, with distance. A man in row 2, who earlier had pretended not to hear anything, finally spoke. "You ever get the feeling," he said quietly, "that the story just flipped?" Victoria's head snapped toward him. "Excuse me." He didn't reply. He didn't have to. At the front, Olivia Reed stood near the cockpit door, headset in place. She had just received an encrypted update on her crew tablet, an internal message from Helios HQ. The text was short. "Clinical operational audit in progress. Maintain full professionalism. Do not discuss details. Executive level oversight active." She looked up from the screen, heartbeat steadying. It wasn't a warning. It was a signal, a gentle reminder that order was being restored from above. She exhaled quietly and glanced down the aisle. Malcolm Grant was still standing near the galley, his posture easy, gaze thoughtful. He hadn't said a single word in nearly 20 minutes, yet every shift in the cabin seemed to orbit him. Victoria, sensing the change, grew restless. She pressed her call button. The light pinged. Sarah approached polite, measured, but her expression lacked the earlier softness. "Yes, Ms." Langston Victoria frowned. What's happening? Why are we still here? Can someone at least explain? Sarah folded her hands in front of her. We're experiencing a brief systems delay, ma'am. We appreciate your patience. That's not good enough, Victoria said sharply. I need to know when we're taking off. I'm afraid I don't have that information. Victoria stared at her, incredulous. I know people at corporate, she said, voice firming with old entitlement. Do you understand I could make one call and have this plane reassigned? Sarah didn't flinch. Of course, ma'am. Then she turned and walked away, calm, unhurried, almost weightless. For the first time since boarding, Victoria realized she'd lost her audience. The crew no longer revolved around her. They revolved around something else, something larger, quieter, and far more powerful. In the galley, Malcolm checked his phone again. A message from Naomi appeared. Delays active. No interventions needed. Observation continues. He nodded to himself. That was enough. At Helios HQ, Naomi watched the system metrics stabilize. A faint smile crossed her face, not satisfaction, but confirmation. Status on 4721, she asked. Crew calm. Cabin stable, a technician replied. Behavioral index returning to baseline. Good, Naomi said. Keep recording until we're airborne. The junior engineer beside her hesitated, then asked softly, Ma'am, was that necessary? The slowdown. Naomi's gaze stayed on the screen. Sometimes a system doesn't listen until it feels the weight of its own pause. Her tone was steady, but there was a flicker of emotion behind it. Not anger, not triumph, just something like moral gravity. Resume monitoring, she said. Back on the plane. The air was thick with quiet comprehension. People were connecting dots they hadn't realized existed. Victoria shifted again, tugging at her shawl. The silence around her was unbearable now. She pressed her lips together, scanning for allies, anyone who might meet her gaze and validate her. No one did. Olivia passed by, calm and distant, speaking softly into her comm. Yes, Captain, confirmed. We remain on hold. Victoria's voice rose again. This is ridiculous. I'll call the airline myself. From the back, someone murmured, You already did. Laughter didn't follow. It wasn't a joke. I remember that moment, the way power seemed to dissolve out of her voice, like air escaping a balloon. No one shouted. No one scolded her. They just stopped believing her. Malcolm remained silent. His silence wasn't revenge. It was the sound of balance returning. Olivia, sensing the tension ease, approached him quietly. Mr. Grant, she said softly, we've just been told the network is experiencing temporary latency across several hubs. We'll resume shortly. He nodded once. I'm sure you will. She hesitated, then asked, almost as if to herself, You knew this would happen. He didn't answer directly. He just looked at her, eyes calm, voice low. Sometimes the best way to correct a system is to let it see itself stall. Olivia stood there for a second longer, then nodded slowly, understanding more than she could admit. As she walked back toward the cockpit, she passed Victoria, who sat rigid, pretending to be unbothered. But her eyes betrayed her. She could feel the invisible shift the way everyone's focus had moved away from her, toward the man she'd tried to dismiss. The hum of the cabin changed again, not louder, not softer, just clearer, and in that clarity, even the air felt different. Outside, on the runway, ground control relayed updates, network delay lifting in 90 seconds, across the Helios network. Amber lights on Naomi's screen turned green, one by one. She watched the change with quiet satisfaction, then turned off her mic. "Reset complete," she said. "Justice delivered. Not punishment justice, the kind that doesn't need applause, only equilibrium." Back inside Flight 4721, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We'll be resuming taxi shortly." Malcolm looked down at his watch, then back at the reflection in the galley wall. Exactly 7 minutes. I thought then, this is what power looks like when it's wise enough to stay invisible. He didn't move toward his seat. Not yet. He just stood there, letting the silence do what it always does when truth finally lands, speak for itself. The sound came first, the soft, hydraulic sigh of the cabin door opening again. Heads turned almost in unison. No unexpected movement now. The flight had been sealed, or so they thought. But then 2 men stepped aboard. Not passengers. Executives. Their suits were immaculate, their expressions controlled. They carried the kind of quiet authority that comes from proximity to power. But their eyes held something else: urgency. Brian Owens and Ethan Park, senior vice presidents of Helios Aviation Group. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't have to. Their presence did it for them. Olivia met them at the doorway, startled. "Gentlemen." It's all right," Brian said gently. "We're here at the direct request of headquarters. Naomi's network in Denver had already briefed them. Protocol Nova was in motion, and when Malcolm Grant activated it, no one second-guessed. They responded." The 2 men moved down the aisle quietly. Conversations hushed to nothing. The whisper of their shoes on the carpet seemed to echo through the entire cabin. Victoria Langston watched, confusion flickering across her face. She straightened her posture, instinctively performing poise that reflexive armor of the privileged. She even smiled faintly, assuming they were here for her. Finally, she murmured, "Someone's taking this seriously." They didn't look at her. Their eyes found Malcolm Grant, standing in the galley, calm as stone. Brian stopped first. His expression softened, not deference, exactly, but recognition. "Mr. Grant," he said, voice low, steady. Ethan nodded once. "Sir?" Malcolm turned slightly, as though he had been expecting them. There was no surprise in his face, only stillness, the kind that comes from a man who has already measured the outcome before it arrives. "Gentlemen," he said quietly. You could feel the collective realization sweep through the cabin. The whispers died for good this time. One sentence, "Mr. Grant, sir," was all it took for the illusion to collapse. Victoria blinked, her confidence cracking like thin glass. "Wait," she stammered. "You know him." Brian's eyes shifted toward her, briefly professional, detached. "We do, ma'am." "I don't understand," she said, voice trembling now. "Who is he?" No one answered right away. And then, from somewhere in the back of the cabin, a voice whispered what everyone else was already thinking. "He's the founder." The word spread like electricity through water, quiet, unstoppable. Malcolm stepped forward, not rushing, not pausing, simply reclaiming the space that had always been his. He stopped at row 1, the gray blanket still draped across his seat 1E, the one Victoria had claimed. The silence that followed was unbearable in its simplicity. He looked at her, not unkindly, but directly. "Ms. Langston," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "I'll be sitting in my seat now." There was no anger, no trace of satisfaction, only clarity. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The practiced confidence that had carried her through countless first-class lounges and charity galas failed her completely. Her hands twitched slightly as she began to gather the blanket. Her movements were small, mechanical. Olivia approached, quietly assisting. "Allow me, ma'am," she said, folding the blanket neatly and removing the pillow. It was a kind gesture, but it made the humiliation worse. Victoria lowered her eyes. "I didn't know," she murmured, almost to herself. "No one told me Malcolm didn't interrupt. He didn't offer reassurance or reproach. He simply waited until the space was clear, then stepped past her and took his seat. One knee. His seat. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of a verdict. Around him, the passengers watched in complete silence. Some looked ashamed, others relieved. A few, perhaps the ones who had recorded earlier, turned off their cameras, realizing that the story they had captured no longer belonged to gossip. It belonged to history. Brian leaned toward Olivia. "The flight can resume," he said quietly. "Mr. Grant's instructions will follow once airborne." Olivia nodded, her voice steady now. "Yes, sir." As the two executives stepped back toward the exit, Victoria's voice broke through the quiet. "Wait," she said softly. "Please, I didn't mean." Brian paused, looked at her briefly. "Ms. Langston, this situation is already being reviewed. You'll be contacted by corporate." Her eyes darted to Malcolm, desperate for a sign of forgiveness, but he was looking straight ahead, gaze fixed on nothing in particular. His hands rested lightly on the armrests, composed, unflinching. He didn't look victorious. He looked resolved. I remember thinking, the man who can stay silent in his own vindication understands power in its purest form. Victoria sank back into her seat, 1D the seat that was hers, and hers alone now. No one spoke to her. No one offered comfort. The cabin, once filled with quiet envy for her luxury, now treated her like a ghost. Even Sarah, who passed by with a tray of water, avoided her eyes. "Would you care for a drink, Mr. Grant?" Sarah asked gently. "Water's fine," he said. His voice was calm again, light but firm, the same tone he'd used from the very start. That was what made it powerful. He hadn't changed. The world around him had. The engines roared softly to life. The vibration rolled through the cabin floor, low and steady, like the heartbeat of the moment itself. As the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, the world outside blurred into motion. Victoria sat motionless, staring at the seat back ahead. She could feel the weight of every look, not of hatred, but of truth. The admiration, she was used to the subtle nods. The quiet respect bought by money had vanished. What replaced it wasn't cruelty. It was judgment. People didn't need to speak it aloud. The silence did that for them. Across the aisle, a man in 2A closed his laptop slowly and whispered to no one in particular, "Dignity flies first." I remember that line because it hung there soft, almost sacred, and in that moment, every person in the cabin understood what it meant. Not a slogan, not a brand, a truth. Malcolm took a slow breath, leaned back in his seat, and closed his eyes. Outside, the runway lights flickered in perfect rhythm. Inside, justice had already taken off. The engines hummed softly, a low, steady vibration that filled the cabin with uneasy calm. Outside, dawn light spilled across the tarmac, pale gold through the oval windows. Inside, silence sat heavier than before. No one moved. No one dared to. Victoria Langston sat in seat 1D, spine stiff, hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her scarf. The world around her, the one she had shaped so easily with charm, wealth, and entitlement, had shifted beyond her control. Beside her, Malcolm Grant sat in 1E, relaxed, eyes closed. He wasn't pretending to sleep. He was letting stillness do the speaking. That, perhaps, was what unnerved her most. For a few minutes, she tried to stay quiet to regain composure, to let time bury what had just happened. But silence, in that moment, didn't protect her. It only magnified what everyone already knew. Then, in a brittle voice, she broke. "This is ridiculous," she said aloud, more to herself than anyone. "I was the one who felt unsafe." The words hung in the air, sharp and defensive. Olivia Reed, standing near the galley, turned slightly. She didn't respond. Victoria pressed on, louder now. He was standing over me. I didn't know who he was. I felt threatened." That last word, threatened, hit the air like static. It was the same word she'd used earlier, the same word that had nearly pushed this entire flight into chaos. Only this time, no one believed it. From row 3, a man's voice came, steady but firm. "No, ma'am, that's not what happened." Victoria's head snapped toward him. "Excuse me." He met her gaze evenly. "We all saw it. You took both seats." He asked politely for his own. "You told him to go to coach." Her jaw tightened. "You don't understand." A woman 2 rows back interrupted, voice calm, almost motherly. "We understand just fine. You used that word unsafe because you thought it would protect you. But it wasn't fear. It was pride." The air thickened. Olivia didn't intervene. She didn't need to. The cabin had found its own voice, now a collective conscience taking shape in real time. Victoria tried to smile, but her voice betrayed her. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just uncomfortable." From row 2, another passenger spoke. "Uncomfortable isn't the same as endangered. You made it sound like he was a threat." Her cheeks flushed. "He was standing so close he was waiting," said the man quietly, "for the seat you stole." Every eye in the cabin turned toward her. Malcolm didn't move, didn't look at her. He didn't need to. His silence drew more attention than her defense ever could. I remember that silence vividly, how it didn't feel empty, but full of restraint, full of meaning, full of everything that wasn't said. Victoria looked around, searching for a sympathetic face. There were none. The same people who had once smiled at her boarding confidence now stared at her with quiet disappointment. Not cruelty, just clarity. Olivia took a slow step forward, her voice calm but edged with resolve. "Ms. Langston," she said, "please take this time to relax. The situation is resolved." Victoria turned toward her, disbelief flickering. "You're siding with him." Olivia paused, not defensive, just direct. "I'm siding with the truth." The words landed like a verdict. Victoria's lips parted, but no sound came. She looked toward the window, as if she could find a way out through the reflection of her own face. Her image stared back, composed, painted, hollow. Malcolm exhaled quietly, eyes still closed. Every breath of his seemed to balance the air again. Across the aisle, a man leaned toward his wife. "You noticed something," he whispered, what he never once raised his voice. She nodded. That's why it hit harder. I remember thinking the loudest lesson in a room often comes from the one who says nothing at all. Victoria, realizing she had lost the narrative, tried one last time. "I'm the victim here," she said faintly, as if repeating it might make it true. A soft chuckle came from somewhere behind her, not mocking, but sad. "No, ma'am," the voice said. "You were the cause. It wasn't cruel. It was honest." The words broke the last thread of illusion. Even Victoria seemed to know it. Her body sank back into the seat, shoulders folding in. The power she had wielded, the invisible privilege that once filled every room she entered, had vanished. She wasn't being punished. She was simply being seen. Olivia walked past once more, her movements quiet, composed. She paused near Malcolm's row, then continued without a word. Malcolm finally opened his eyes. For a brief moment, he looked around, not triumphantly, not even knowingly, just present. Then, softly, he reached for the seatbelt, clicked it into place, and rested his hands. No speech, no correction, only dignity. And somehow, that was louder than anything else that could have been said. Outside, the engines hummed deeper, preparing for takeoff. Inside, something heavier than gravity held the cabin in stillness. Victoria stared straight ahead, her reflection now framed by the faint vibration of the window pane. For the first time, she looked small, not because of who sat beside her, but because she had built her power on others' silence. And now, that silence no longer served her. Malcolm, meanwhile, stared forward, eyes steady, expression neutral. If he felt vindicated, he didn't show it. If he felt anger, it had already been burned into wisdom long before this flight. The truth had surfaced. That was enough. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for departure. Please fasten your seatbelts." The words rolled through the cabin like a gentle reset. Passengers obeyed quietly. The hum of buckles clicking filled the air. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she fastened hers. The sound of the metal clasp locking echoed louder than she expected. Malcolm didn't look at her. He didn't need to. Sometimes, justice isn't something you deliver, it's something you allow to reveal itself. As the plane began to move, a shaft of sunlight cut through the cabin, catching the edge of Malcolm's sleeve. For a second, it looked almost symbolic light returning to the seat that had once been denied. The plane rolled forward, slow and deliberate. And as it lifted from the ground, the story that had begun as humiliation became something else, a quiet restoration of truth, carried not by words, but by stillness. By the time Skylink's Flight 4721 touched down in Boston, the world inside that airplane had changed. Not because of turbulence or time, but because of truth. The landing was smooth, almost too gentle for what it carried. No one clapped, no one spoke. Even the seatbelt chime felt subdued, as if the plane itself understood the weight of what had just unfolded. Malcolm Grant sat quietly in 1E, still composed, hands folded in his lap. He didn't look like a man who had won anything. He looked like a man who had decided something. The captain's voice came over the speaker, low and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience and cooperation during this flight. Please remain seated until further notice." It was unusual, but no one questioned it. When the doors finally opened, the first people to step aboard were not new passengers or ground staff. They were security personnel and Helios executives, summoned directly from headquarters. Olivia Reed, standing near the galley, glanced toward Malcolm. He gave her a single nod, calm, measured. That was all the permission she needed. The crew was asked to disembark first. Every one of them, Olivia, Sarah, the co-pilot, even Captain Holt. No anger, no accusations, just quiet direction, a complete crew rotation, the operations officer explained. No one argued as they left. Olivia met Malcolm's eyes one last time. There was no resentment there, only understanding. She knew this wasn't punishment, it was accountability. I remember thinking real justice doesn't scream for revenge. It simply restores the order that arrogance broke. Minutes later, the cabin emptied, except for Malcolm and the ground coordinators who waited silently by the door. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and stepped out. By the time he reached the terminal, Naomi Clark was already on a video call from Denver. Her face appeared on a secured tablet, calm but resolute. "Mr. Grant," she began, "we've completed the initial network review. Full behavioral logs are recorded. I've also pulled background data on the passenger involved, Ms. Langston." Malcolm nodded. "What did you find?" Naomi tapped her screen. 2 previous incidents, both within the past year, both flagged under customer privilege abuse. She demanded seat changes, claimed medical exceptions, threatened staff. She hesitated, then added, "Each case was dismissed after a donation to our executive charity wing." Malcolm's expression didn't change, but the silence that followed was sharper than anger. "I see," he said finally. "Mark both cases for review." And Naomi, yes. Sir, expunge any internal record labeling her as VIP. She forfeited that today. Naomi nodded once, understood. He paused, eyes distant, voice steady. "This isn't about punishing her," he said. "It's about redefining what we call value." Naomi didn't reply. She didn't need to. At that exact moment, in 3 Helios control centers across the country, internal bulletins went out. Effective, immediately temporary grounding of Skylink's executive routes for internal training audit, purpose reaffirmation of company values regarding passenger dignity and professional conduct. It looked procedural. It wasn't. It was moral infrastructure in motion. Within hours, the story began to spread not from Malcolm, not from Helios, but from the passengers themselves. One video clip leaked online, Victoria's voice, trembling with false fear, followed by a passenger saying calmly, "That's not what happened." It traveled fast, but what caught the world's attention wasn't outrage. It was the stillness of the man who never responded. Malcolm refused interviews, declined comment. He didn't need the noise. He had already begun something far quieter, far more enduring. In Denver, Naomi stood in the operations room, watching the internal message go live across Helios's global network. The banner was simple. White background. 2 words. Black text, "Dignity flies first." No slogan, no press release. Just a declaration, small, powerful, impossible to ignore. Every Helios employee received it on their screens. Simultaneously pilots, mechanics, call center reps, baggage handlers. Attached beneath the banner was a single memo, written personally by Malcolm to every member of the Helios family. The measure of an airline isn't found in its profits, or its planes, or its prestige. It's found in how we treat people, especially when no one is watching. Today, I was reminded that silence is not weakness. Sometimes, it's the only language dignity understands. From this day forward, let us make one promise that no seat, no title, no privilege will ever rank higher than respect. Because dignity doesn't board last, it flies first. Malcolm Grant, CEO, Helios Aviation Group. By nightfall, the message had spread across the industry. Competitors called it branding brilliance. But for those who knew Malcolm, for those who'd seen him that morning, standing quietly in a narrow aisle while the world judged him, it wasn't branding, it was philosophy. In Boston, Victoria Langston sat alone in the arrivals lounge, staring blankly at her phone. Her name was already trending, not for her wealth, but for her arrogance. No one called her Miss Langston anymore. Online, she was just the woman with the blanket. She had tried to post a defense, said she was misunderstood, that she felt intimidated. But the world had already decided. Not through hate, through recognition. The comments weren't cruel. Most were simply variations of the same thought. It wasn't about fear. It was about dignity. Malcolm never responded to her apology request. He didn't need to. Some lessons lose their meaning when you say them aloud. In Denver, Naomi watched the ripple effect of the memo employees sharing it quietly, some saving it, some printing it. At midnight, she texted Malcolm one line, message received, all departments aligned. He replied minutes later, then let's fly differently. I remember that exchange short, almost casual, but in it lived the spirit of everything he believed. Justice, not as spectacle, but as system. Weeks later, Skylinks introduced small but symbolic changes, cabin training programs on perception bias, a new code for staff behavior integrity level. Every crew member received a handbook embossed with a single phrase, "Dignity flies first." And on one quiet evening, months later, Malcolm stood alone in a Helios hangar in Denver, watching as the first aircraft rolled out with the new motto painted beneath its silver logo. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just stood there, hands in pockets, eyes reflecting the letters. Because sometimes the truest declarations don't come from microphones or press conferences. They come from the steady heartbeat of a man who refused to move until the world learned why. Change rarely announces itself with noise. Sometimes it begins with something as small as a memo, or a phrase printed in quiet black letters on the side of a plane. For Helios Aviation Group, that phrase was "Dignity flies first." At first, the industry called it marketing. Then they realized it was revolution. 3 weeks after the Boston flight, Helios unveiled its reform initiative, a measured, data-driven, and deeply human overhaul of the airline experience. They didn't frame it as damage control. They called it the Dignity Framework. It wasn't about passengers versus crew or race versus privilege. It was about how people treat each other when they think no one is watching. Malcolm Grant had insisted on that line during the internal meeting. We're not fixing an incident. We're refining a culture. The executives had nodded, some inspired, some wary. The first change came quietly, through the software. Every Helios flight now displayed an invisible metric in the company's operations dashboard, the Dignity Score, a real-time measure drawn from behavioral analytics, passenger feedback, and crew professionalism. No one outside the system saw the number at first, but its presence changed everything. Every employee knew it was there, not as surveillance, but as a mirror. Naomi Clark had designed it herself with the Helios data team. The algorithm tracked patterns, tone of communication, complaint frequency, incident escalation rates, empathy and crew responses. It wasn't about perfection. It was about awareness. Naomi explained it best during the rollout meeting. We used to measure only efficiency and profit. But if we can measure speed, we can measure respect. That line spread across Helios like wildfire. Within a month, the anonymous feedback channel went live, open to passengers and crew alike. It wasn't routed to customer service. It went straight to the Dignity Core team, reporting directly to Malcolm's office. The first submission came from a flight attendant in Miami. She wrote simply, "Today. A passenger helped me pick up a dropped coffee pot. I just wanted to say that kindness counts too." It wasn't a complaint. It was gratitude. And for Malcolm, reading it late that night in his Denver office, that one message meant more than any press release ever could. He knew the movement had begun to breathe on its own. By the second month, the system was live across the fleet. Every plane, every terminal, every shift measured, observed, evolving. Some employees feared it at first. Others embraced it like oxygen. "I work better when someone's watching," one gate agent joked during training. "No," his supervisor replied. "You work better when you know someone cares." The numbers didn't lie. Complaint rates dropped 40%. Crew satisfaction rose 25%. Turnover fell. Passengers began to notice too. Helios feels different. One frequent flyer wrote on social media, "People look you in the eye again." That post went viral. By week 8, the hashtag Dignity Flies First was trending across the U.S. News anchors debated whether Helios's new policy was a stroke of corporate genius or a subtle indictment of the entire airline industry. Malcolm didn't join the debate. He just watched quietly, as if he already knew where it was heading. Because the truth was, it wasn't just about airlines anymore. Across the country, other industries began to take notice. Retail companies called Helios for consultation. Banks reached out to Naomi for training frameworks. Even a hospital network requested licensing rights for the Dignity Score model. For the first time in decades, ethics had gone viral. Malcolm's assistant once asked him how he felt about it. He smiled faintly and said, "It feels overdue." Still, not everyone celebrated. Competitors mocked it. "Airlines are here to move people," one rival CEO said on a business channel, "not teach them manners." Malcolm didn't reply publicly, but within Helios, his words circulated quietly through leadership. "If moving people is all we do, we're just buses with wings. But if we move them and remind them who they are, then we're something better." The staff printed that on posters inside break rooms. Meanwhile, Naomi Clark continued refining the data system. The Dignity Score dashboard became a tool of empowerment, not discipline. It highlighted not just failures, but moments of grace. When a ground agent in Dallas stayed after hours to help an elderly woman find her lost wedding ring, it showed. When a pilot in Seattle personally greeted a nervous child before takeoff, it showed. Helios began publishing anonymous dignity moments on their internal network each week. The effect was contagious. People started competing, not for recognition, but for decency. "I used to think leadership was about results," Naomi said one night, staring at the glowing metric screen in her office. "Now, I think it's about reflection." I remember that line because it captured exactly what Malcolm had intended, not a revolution of policy, but of perception. By the third month, social media had turned the phrase "dignity flies first" into a movement. Celebrities quoted it. Churches referenced it in sermons. Teachers used it in classrooms. For once, a corporate slogan had transcended the corporation. Even the passengers from Flight 4721 spoke up. One posted, "I was on that flight. I saw a man get treated like he didn't belong and then show the whole plane what belonging really means. I haven't forgotten it." Another wrote, "He never raised his voice. That's the part I'll tell my grandkids. In Boston. Victoria Langston saw those posts too. She stayed quiet online. Her friends told her to issue a public statement, maybe join a talk show, spin the narrative. But every time she opened her mouth to justify, she heard his silence again, the still, unreactive calm of the man she had misjudged. In that quiet, she finally understood. By the end of the quarter, Helios announced its financial report. Profits were steady. But what stunned the analysts was something else. The company's reputation index had doubled. For the first time, investors described morality as a market advantage. A headline in The Atlantic summed it up perfectly. Helios didn't just fix its image, it rebuilt its soul. Malcolm didn't give interviews. He didn't stand on stage or pose beside planes. He simply kept showing up in meetings, in hangars, in training rooms, listening more than he spoke. When asked once what he thought of the movement he'd created, he said softly, "It was never about a movement, it was about a mirror." I remember watching him leave the Denver office one evening, the same calm posture, the same deliberate steps. He moved like a man who had learned the hardest truth of all, that the power to change others begins with refusing to let bitterness change you. The sky outside was fading into dusk, the horizon still streaked with gold, and somewhere above those clouds, Helios Flight 742 was cruising at 36,000 feet. Its dignity score flashed green perfect. For the first time since the program began, no one on board knew it, but maybe they didn't have to. Because some revolutions don't need banners or applause. They only need people who choose quietly to be better. Success has a way of testing people faster than failure ever does. Inside the glass headquarters of Helios Aviation Group in Denver, the air was heavy, not with celebration, but with tension, the kind that hides behind polite applause. 3 months after the Dignity framework went global, the company's numbers were steady, its reputation soaring, but not everyone was pleased. Behind closed doors, a quiet resistance had begun to form. They didn't call it rebellion, they called it realism. At the center of it was Harold Kent, Chief Financial Officer, a man whose loyalty had always leaned toward numbers, not principles. He was tall, silver-haired, and immaculately dressed, the kind of executive who believed spreadsheets revealed more truth than people ever could. To him, ethics were admirable until they touched the profit margin, and lately they had employee retraining, customer empathy audits, digital infrastructure for the Dignity score. All of it cost money, millions, in fact. And while Helios's reputation had risen, quarterly profits had dipped by 2%. Harold saw that as evidence. During the board's quarterly strategy session, he finally said what others only whispered. "We're running an airline, not a philosophy seminar." The room went silent. Malcolm Grant sat at the head of the long oak table, expression unreadable. Harold continued, emboldened by the stillness. "Public sentiment doesn't pay our fuel bills. These reforms, admirable as they sound, are hurting operational efficiency. People come to Helios to fly, not to be taught moral lessons." No one spoke. Naomi Clark, seated to Malcolm's right, watched carefully. She'd seen this kind of challenge before, not from hostility, but from blindness, the blindness of habit. Malcolm didn't respond right away. He let the quiet stretch, letting Harold's own words echo back at him. Then, softly, he said, "Tell me, Harold, do you believe respect is a luxury?" Harold frowned slightly. "Of course not, but it's not a metric. It's sentiment. We can't run a company on sentiment. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. We can run one on greed. Harold blinked. That's not what I said. No. Malcolm replied. But it's what you meant. The air in the boardroom shifted. He didn't raise his voice, but his calm was cutting like a scalpel, not a sword. I remember thinking he never confronts a man with anger. He simply holds up a mirror and lets him see what's already there. Malcolm stood then, walked to the window overlooking the city. The Denver skyline shimmered in late afternoon light, glass towers, sunlight, and the faint reflection of his own face. Without turning, he said, Harold, do you know what I learned on that flight? The question hung heavy. Harold hesitated. Sir Malcolm's voice remained even. I learned that the most expensive thing any company can lose isn't money. It's its soul. He turned, eyes calm, almost weary. We spent decades chasing profit, and in one morning, a woman with a blanket nearly destroyed everything we built because we forgot that human dignity isn't a cost center. It's the core. Silence filled the room like smoke. No one moved. Even Naomi, who had heard him deliver countless speeches, felt something different in this one. It wasn't performance, it was confession. Malcolm walked back to his seat, slow, deliberate. If you think ethics is expensive, try living without it. That line landed like thunder. Harold opened his mouth, closed it again. There was nothing left to say. The meeting ended without conclusion, but the decision had already been made, just not out loud. 2 days later, the internal memo came quietly. Subject: organizational realignment. Finance division. Harold Kent, it said, would be transitioning to an advisory role. In plain English, it meant demotion. No one was surprised. Some whispered that Malcolm had moved too fast, too harshly. Others said he'd waited too long. Malcolm himself didn't comment. He simply told Naomi one thing. You can't build a culture of dignity with people who see it as decoration. Naomi nodded. Then who replaces him? Malcolm smiled faintly. Someone who still believes numbers can serve people, not replace them. Within a week, Elena Morales, a mid-level finance director known for her fairness and sharp intuition, was promoted to acting CFO. Her first act was to restructure the quarterly reports, adding a new category beneath revenue, cost, and efficiency. It was labeled simply Ethical Performance Index. When asked what that meant, she answered, It means we're finally measuring what matters. Across Helios, word of Harold's removal spread quickly. To some, it was a warning. To others, a reassurance. In the maintenance hangars, the pilots' lounges, the customer service desks, people spoke quietly about it. And something subtle began to happen. Where there had been cynicism, there was now conviction. A ramp worker in Atlanta told his crew, if the boss can fire the CFO for ethics, maybe he means it. An attendant in Chicago said, it feels different now, like we're protected by something that isn't policy, it's principle. Helios's internal forums flooded with anonymous posts. Finally, someone's walking the talk. Dignity isn't just for customers, it's for us too. Meanwhile, Harold packed his office in silence. He wasn't angry, not exactly, just bewildered. For 30 years, he'd believed leadership was about control, about keeping the company safe from idealists like Malcolm. But now, watching the sunset reflect off the Helios logo outside his window, he wondered if maybe he'd been the one who didn't understand safety at all. That night, as the building emptied, Malcolm walked through the finance floor. Most of the lights were off, but Harold's door was still open. Malcolm paused in the doorway. Harold looked up, surprised. "I didn't expect I'd know." Malcolm said, "I came to thank you." Harold frowned. "For what?" "For reminding me that leadership isn't about being right." Malcolm said, "It's about remembering why we started." There was no hostility in his voice, only clarity. Harold nodded slowly. "And if I forgot that Malcolm met his eyes, then it's not too late to remember." He turned to leave, then added quietly, "But not here." And just like that, it was done. Not with punishment, but with finality. I remember thinking some men are removed from power not to be destroyed, but to stop them from destroying what they can't yet understand. The next morning, a new plaque appeared in the Helios lobby, small, brushed steel, understated. It read, "Integrity is not an expense. It's the engine." No one claimed authorship, but everyone knew who wrote it. By week's end, the ripple of Harold's departure had settled into calm, but beneath that calm was conviction stronger, quieter, permanent. And as Malcolm stood by the window of his office, watching the early morning planes rise into the blue, he felt something steady return, not pride, not victory, but balance. Because leadership, he knew, wasn't about keeping the fire burning. It was about keeping it pure. It began with a photograph. Just a single image, one empty seat, bathed in soft overhead light, shot from the aisle of a Helios aircraft. No passengers, no faces, just absence. The tagline beneath it read, "Respect isn't a luxury." That was all. No corporate logo in the corner, no press statement, just the image, quietly uploaded to Helios's internal site late on a Sunday night. By morning, it was everywhere. The campaign had no press agency behind it, no marketing department drafting slogans. It came directly from Malcolm Grant's office, or more precisely, from his silence. The photo was taken by Naomi Clark. She'd stayed late after a routine inspection, walking through an empty aircraft, checking the lighting before a maintenance cycle. When she reached row 3, she stopped. Seat 3C unoccupied, illuminated by a single lamp from above, looked almost sacred in the still cabin. There was something poetic in its emptiness, something that seemed to carry the weight of every story Helios had lived through. She took one picture. No flash, no filter. Later, when she showed it to Malcolm, he studied it quietly. After a long pause, he said, "Let's make that our reminder. Reminder of what Naomi asked." He looked at the photo again, of what happens when dignity leaves the room. The campaign launched under a simple name, Project Seat 3C. Internally, it was framed as an initiative to promote empathy and awareness within Helios. But when the image leaked online, it became something much larger. People didn't see a brand. They saw a mirror. Within days, social media was filled with versions of the photo, sometimes edited, sometimes copied, always shared with the same caption, "Yashin Seat 3C respect isn't a luxury." Celebrities changed their profile pictures to it. Teachers used it in classrooms. Even a few politicians posted it with cautious approval. No one could fully explain why it struck such a chord. Maybe it was the timing, a world tired of outrage, looking for quiet meaning. Maybe it was the simplicity, a seat, a shadow, and a truth too obvious to debate. But, mostly, it was because the story behind it, though never mentioned by name, was known. People remembered the video, the woman with the blanket, the man who didn't yell. They remembered how he'd stayed silent, how his calm had forced the world to confront itself. The image became shorthand for that silence, an emblem of unspoken justice. Inside Helios headquarters, Naomi watched the numbers climb engagement, mentions, brand sentiment. But Malcolm didn't ask for metrics. He didn't hold press conferences or interviews. He didn't claim ownership. When a journalist cornered him after a corporate summit and asked if he was the mind behind Seat 3C, he smiled faintly and said, "No one owns respect. We just forgot where we left it." That quote went viral too, though he never intended it to. I remember watching the image appear everywhere, airport billboards, coffee shops, even in the background of morning news shows. And every time, the same quiet feeling would settle over me. Not triumph, not even pride. Just recognition that sometimes the simplest symbols carry the heaviest truths. Within Helios, the empty seat took on a life of its own. Every aircraft in the fleet now carried a small plaque near Row 3, Seat 3C, dedicated to dignity in flight. It wasn't ceremonial. It was a vow. Flight attendants were trained to explain it if passengers asked. What's special about that seat, someone would say. And the attendants would answer, softly. It reminds us that everyone deserves their place. Passengers started requesting 3C just to sit there, even though it wasn't first class. Some wrote letters saying they'd cried when they saw it. One woman, a retired teacher from Georgia, wrote, "For once, an airline reminded me of something schools try to teach, but the world forgets respect doesn't cost extra." In time, the symbol moved beyond Helios. Other airlines began installing their own empty seat tributes, some authentic, some opportunistic. The idea spread to hotels, trains, even public institutions, everywhere. A single, unoccupied chair began to appear in lobbies, terminals, boardrooms accompanied by the same 6 words, "Respect isn't a luxury." Remember that. Governments called it corporate empathy. Churches called it modern parable. Malcolm called it enough. When asked by his communications team whether they should trademark the campaign, he refused. "You can't trademark conscience," he said. "If people want to carry the message, let them." That's how truth travels. So Helios didn't copyright the image. They released it under public domain. That single decision turned a company gesture into a human statement. Naomi once asked him, late one evening as they walked past the hangar where the original 3C aircraft was docked, "Why that seat? Malcolm? Why not the one you were denied?" He smiled, "Because that one's already taken." She frowned, not understanding. He continued, "Seat 1E was about pride. Seat 3C is about perspective." And with that, he kept walking, the echo of his steps mixing with the distant hum of engines. I remember that line because it explained everything. The seat wasn't about revenge or status. It was about reminder. A place forever unfilled so we'd never forget what happens when respect leaves the room. Months later, the New York Times published a feature titled "The Empty Seat That Changed the Sky." They called it the most effective act of silent protest in modern corporate history. Malcolm declined to be interviewed for the piece. He sent a 2-line response instead. "Some lessons are meant to be seen, not spoken." That was printed at the end of the article, italicized, centered, unedited. Even now, years later, Seat 3C remains untouched on every Helios aircraft. No one sits there, not executives, not passengers. Before takeoff, flight attendants still check it, straighten the belt, smooth the fabric, adjust the light above it. It's not superstition, it's respect. And every time a plane lifts into the sky, that empty seat rises too, a quiet monument traveling across the clouds, reminding the world that dignity, once restored, must never again be forgotten. The hearing room smelled faintly of wood polish and tension. Rows of dark leather chairs curved around the semicircular dais, microphones poised like sentinels. Cameras waited in silence. It was one of those mornings in Washington when the light itself seemed to pause, filtering through the blinds, landing across papers, faces, and polished brass nameplates. At the center of it all sat Malcolm Grant, wearing the same calm expression that had followed him through every storm. He was here not as a victim, not as a CEO defending a scandal, but as a man making the case for something most people thought couldn't be legislated respect. The plaque before him read Mr. Malcolm Grant, Founder, Helios Aviation Group. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to be reminded who he was. It had been 6 months since the launch of Seat 3C. What began as a photograph had become a movement. What began as a movement had become a metric. And what began as a metric had now brought him to Capitol Hill. The Senate Transportation Committee had called him to testify on a proposed bill, the Dignity Framework Act, a federal guideline to regulate ethical standards in aviation. To most people, it sounded bureaucratic. To Malcolm, it was the final mile of a long, quiet journey from injustice to institution. He didn't come to preach. He came to explain. The chairwoman of the committee, Senator Linda Avery, adjusted her glasses and leaned into the microphone. "Mr. Grant," she began, "we appreciate your presence. You've become somewhat of a cultural figure since the incident." Malcolm inclined his head slightly. "I'm aware." The room gave a faint chuckle, the kind that acknowledges tension without breaking it. Senator Avery continued, "Your company's policies have sparked global conversation. The purpose of today's hearing is to understand whether this dignity framework can or should become a national standard." He nodded once. "Understood. Please proceed with your statement." Malcolm opened the small leather folder before him. He had no speech inside, just a few handwritten notes. Then, without looking down, he spoke. "Madam Chair, members of the committee, I didn't come here to sell an idea. I came to describe a mirror." The sentence hung in the air. 6 months ago, on a routine flight, a woman believed her comfort was more valuable than another person's dignity. It wasn't the first time something like that happened. It just happened to be recorded. He paused. No theatrics, no outrage, just truth. What I learned that morning was simple. Our systems don't fail because people make mistakes. They fail because we design them without conscience. We measure speed, cost, profit, everything except respect. The dignity framework isn't a slogan. It's a structure for accountability. He let the word accountability rest there steady, deliberate. It doesn't punish people. It reminds them that every decision, every gesture, every delay touches a human being on the other end. If we can measure turbulence, we can measure tone. If we can monitor engines, we can monitor empathy. Behind him, the audience journalists, executives, union representatives leaned forward. It was the kind of stillness you could feel. One senator, Richard Malloy, a man known for his blunt skepticism, cleared his throat. "Mr. Grant," he said, "this all sounds noble, but how do we ensure it doesn't turn into another corporate buzzword? People like slogans. They don't like systems that cost money." Malcolm met his eyes. Then perhaps they've forgotten what cost really means. Malloy frowned. "Explain that." A company that ignores respect pays for it anyway in lawsuits, in turnover, in public trust. The question isn't whether dignity has a price, it's whether we keep pretending it's optional. For a moment, even Malloy went silent. Senator Avery leaned back slightly, her face softening. "Mr. Grant," she said, "some might say you've turned an act of discrimination into a movement. Was that your intention?" He smiled faintly. "No, Senator. My intention was to keep my seat." The room broke into quiet laughter. He didn't smile in return, but life has a way of assigning you larger responsibilities when you refuse to react in smaller ways. That line stayed with everyone, especially the older senators, who knew exactly what he meant. After 45 minutes of testimony, Malcolm finished with a single sentence. "I'm not asking you to legislate kindness. I'm asking you to require awareness." He closed his folder. The room, for once, didn't erupt into noise or questions. There was just quiet, the respectful kind. The kind that follows a truth so clear it doesn't need applause. 3 weeks later, the vote came. The Dignity Framework Act passed the Senate with a commanding majority. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. For the first time in U.S. aviation history, airlines were required to report not only safety and efficiency metrics, but also dignity compliance and assessment of ethical behavior in customer and crew interactions. The industry had never seen anything like it. Some called it unnecessary, others called it overdue. Helios didn't celebrate publicly. Malcolm forbade any commercials or corporate campaigns. When his communications director suggested a press statement, he said quietly, "If we have to announce decency, we're already losing it." On the morning, the law was signed. Malcolm stood on the steps of the Capitol, hands in his pockets, watching the flags ripple in the spring wind. Naomi was beside him, holding a folder of press material she'd been told not to use. She looked at him and smiled. "You did it." He shook his head. "No, we just remembered what it was supposed to be." A few steps away, a reporter shouted, "Mr. Grant, will you be giving a statement?" He turned briefly toward the voice, then back to Naomi. "No," he said. "Some moments don't need commentary." Then, quietly, he walked down the marble steps, disappearing into the crowd of ordinary people who didn't even know they were witnessing history. I remember that image Malcolm in his dark suit, blending into the city like a man returning to anonymity. He didn't linger for photos. He didn't stay for interviews. He just smiled once, a small, private smile that carried the weight of everything he'd refused to shout. Because real change, I think, never arrives with applause. It arrives in silence when those who once dismissed dignity finally have to live by it. Weeks later, a small plaque appeared in the hallway outside the committee chamber where he had testified. It bore no title, no name, just one line carved into brushed steel. "Profit may fuel the engine, but respect keeps it in the air." No one claimed authorship, but everyone knew who said it. And somewhere high above that same Capitol dome, a Helios jet traced a thin white line across the morning sky, carrying an empty seat, glowing softly in row 3C, a quiet monument in motion, a reminder that justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just keeps flying. The story that began on a plane ended, years later, in a courtroom, not with shouting, not with verdicts that made headlines, but with a kind of silence that only comes when a person finally runs out of excuses. Victoria Langston sat at the plaintiff's table, her pearl earrings catching the sterile light of the courtroom. Once, those pearls had been symbols of refinement, of belonging. Now they looked like relics from another life, a life that had quietly expired somewhere between arrogance and accountability. Across the aisle, the attorneys for Helios Aviation Group sat calmly, papers stacked in perfect alignment. They didn't look triumphant, just prepared. The case, Langston v. Helios Aviation Group, had begun as an attempt at reclamation. She said she'd been humiliated, unfairly treated, that the airline had weaponized public shame against her, that she'd lost friends, invitations, business connections, all because of what she called an exaggerated misunderstanding. But the evidence told another story. The footage from Flight 4721 was played again, this time on a large courtroom screen. There she was, Victoria Langston, in first class, reclining with her blanket and wine, dismissing the stewardess, laughing as she told Malcolm Grant to take a seat somewhere more suitable. The sound of her own voice filled the room, tinny through the speakers, but clear enough. When she said, "People like me are used to certain standards," even she flinched slightly. Her attorney, a young, ambitious man named Daniel Sykes, had tried to argue context, that the video didn't capture tone, that she'd been anxious, misinterpreted, but the courtroom wasn't buying it. The moment that sentence played, the air seemed to crystallize. It wasn't just what she'd said, it was how easily she'd said it. In the weeks leading up to the trial, investigative journalists had dug through her past old flight logs, staff complaints, social media posts. They found a pattern. Dozens of incidents, demands for free upgrades, threats to call management, complaints about uncomfortable proximity to certain passengers. It painted a portrait she could no longer deny a woman so used to privilege that fairness felt like insult. Helios's defense didn't attack her character. They didn't need to. They just showed her behavior consistent, documented, unvarnished. By the second day, her own lawyer was struggling to find footing. On the third day, he asked to withdraw from the case. The judge allowed it. I remember watching the live coverage not because it was sensational, but because it was strangely quiet. There was no villainous laughter, no dramatic collapse, just a slow unraveling like watching silk thread pulled from a once beautiful gown. At one point, during recess, a journalist asked Victoria, "Do you regret what you said that day?" She paused, maybe the first real pause of her adult life, and replied, "I regret that people misunderstood me. It wasn't apology, it was habit." That sentence alone told the world the trial was over long before the gavel struck. When the verdict came, it was clean and absolute. The court found in favor of Helios Aviation Group. The claim was dismissed with prejudice. That meant she couldn't file again. No appeals, no settlements, just the end. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Reporters shouted questions, microphones lunging like bayonets. Victoria walked quickly, sunglasses on, jaw tight, but you could feel it, the weight of a story she no longer controlled. On social media, the coverage was merciless. The same internet that had once whispered her name in admiration now spoke it like a cautionary tale. Hashtags reappeared. He on seat 3C. Privilege check. Dignity flies first. But Malcolm Grant said nothing. Not a word. A week later, a journalist from the Washington Post asked him for comment. "Do you consider this justice?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Justice is a word that depends on where you're sitting." Then, after another pause, he added, "I didn't fight her. I fought the idea that made her think she was entitled to more humanity than others. The journalist wrote that down. It became the headline. Grant, I'm not against her. I'm against the thinking that made her possible. In the months that followed, Victoria's name faded from the news. Her membership at the Green Hill Country Club was temporarily suspended. Her investment firm replaced her on the board. The charity gala she once chaired quietly removed her name from the program. She wasn't ruined in the dramatic sense. No handcuffs, no bankruptcy, just erased. The kind of erasure that polite society uses when it wants to punish one of its own without admitting she existed. She moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, bought a smaller house, closer to her sister, stopped flying Helios. Of course, though, by then, she didn't fly much at all. Occasionally, people would recognize her at a store, whispering, not cruelly, just with that faint tone of, so that's her. She'd turn away, pretending not to hear, but she always heard. Every few months, Seat 3C would trend again, usually around the anniversary of the incident. The image of that empty chair, glowing under soft light, would fill timelines, and every time, someone somewhere would comment, I wonder what happened to the woman who started it. Most people didn't know her name anymore, but she knew theirs, because the world she'd once believed was built for her had changed quietly, permanently. The industry that once catered to her whims now ran on policies written by the man she'd tried to belittle. And that was the kind of irony only time could write. I sometimes imagine her, years later, sitting by a window, watching planes cross the Arizona sky. Maybe she wonders if one of them is Helios. Maybe she remembers that morning, the blanket, the smirk, the man who didn't raise his voice, and maybe, though she'd never admit it, she feels a small tremor of shame. Because in the end, no court can deliver the kind of justice that silence does. Malcolm never mentioned her again. Not in speeches, not in interviews, not even in private conversation. When a colleague once said, "You must feel vindicated," he replied, "Vindication is just revenge that learned to wear a suit. I'm not interested in that." He turned back to his work expanding the dignity framework to other industries. In his office, on the wall opposite the Seat 3C photograph, hung a smaller frame, a quiet quote on cream paper. Dignity isn't about who wins. It's about who refuses to lose themselves. He never said where he got it, but anyone who knew the story understood. Time, like altitude, changes perspective. Years passed. The world moved on, or at least thought it did. Airlines merged, policies evolved, faces came and went from the headlines. But in one quiet corner of the National Museum of Transportation Reform in Riverstone, a single object drew steady crowds, day after day. A seat 3C. It stood behind a pane of clear glass, lit from above by a narrow beam that made the gray leather look softer than it ever had in flight. The armrest bore a small scratch, a reminder of years of service before history found it. There was no mannequin, no dramatization, just the chair, surrounded by silence. Visitors rarely spoke when they approached it. They simply stood there, reading the small brass plaque mounted below. One man refused to move, the world moved instead. That was all it said. The exhibit wasn't large. It didn't need to be. The museum itself was modern white walls, glass panels, curated light. Yet the area around Seat 3C felt older, heavier, like the air itself understood reverence. People didn't come to take pictures. They came to remember what they hadn't lived but somehow understood. On a weekday afternoon, when the museum was nearly empty, Malcolm Grant walked in through a side entrance, unnoticed. He wasn't there for ceremony. He never was. He wore a gray coat, no entourage, no press, just a folded boarding pass in his hand from a flight long ago. The attendant at the front recognized him, but didn't speak. She only nodded once, as if acknowledging a shared secret. He walked slowly through the hallways, past displays of old ticket counters, safety manuals, and campaign posters about air travel equality, past photos of pilots, mechanics, and attendants, people who'd turned policy into principle. Finally, he reached the room where the seat stood. He didn't approach right away. He just watched it from the doorway, the way one might watch a familiar scene from a dream distant, softened by time. It was smaller than he remembered. Seats always are when they're no longer in motion. He stepped closer. The leather had faded slightly, and a faint line of stitching ran down the side evidence of restoration. The plaque beneath the glass caught his eye again. One man refused to move. The world moved instead. He exhaled quietly. I never refused to move, he thought. I just refused to disappear. But he said nothing aloud. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the folded boarding pass, yellowed with age, creased down the middle. It read Skylinks Air 4721 Portland to Boston, Seat 1E. He placed it gently on the small stand beside the glass. The museum attendant, watching from afar, didn't interrupt. Some gestures don't need permission. Outside, snow had begun to fall over Riverstone. The museum's windows framed the sky pale, almost weightless. Malcolm stood there for a while, watching the reflection of the seat superimposed on the fallen snow. It looked as if it were floating timeless, untethered. He wasn't sentimental by nature. He didn't believe in monuments. But this one, he thought, wasn't about him. It was about what didn't happen that day, the argument that never came, the anger that never took flight. Because sometimes, what a man doesn't do changes more than what he does. A small group of students entered the gallery, led by a guide. They were maybe 16, 17, young enough to be curious, old enough to understand. The guide pointed toward the seat. This, she said softly, was the beginning of the dignity movement. It started with a moment of silence, a man who chose reason over rage. One of the students asked, "Did he ever speak about it later?" The guide smiled faintly. Only once. He said, "Anger can start revolutions, but dignity builds civilizations." The students fell silent, as if that sentence alone carried the weight of the exhibit. Malcolm listened from the corner. He didn't correct her. He didn't say the quote wasn't quite his. Truth. He'd learned. Didn't need ownership to endure. I imagine him standing there, a man older now, but not smaller, hands clasped loosely, gaze steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had already said all there was to say. He wasn't proud. He wasn't sad. He was simply at peace. It's strange, watching history fold back on itself. The man who once stood in a galley, humiliated, now stood in a museum where strangers whispered his name like a lesson. Not a legend. A lesson. That's the difference between fame and consequence. Before leaving, he turned once more toward the seat. Snowlight flickered across the glass, glinting off the metal plaque. He gave a small nod to the seat, to the past, to the silent chain of moments that had carried him here. Then he whispered, not to anyone in particular, "Fly steady," and walked away. Outside, the city moved around him, buses, sirens, people, noise. Life was louder than ever, but inside that building, one empty chair kept teaching silence. Years later, the museum director wrote an article titled "The Seat That Changed the Sky." She ended it with a single line that wasn't on any plaque, but could have been power shouts. Dignity whispers, only one is heard forever. If you visit the museum today, Seat 3C still stands there, still empty, still glowing. Children stare at it, not fully understanding. Adults linger longer than they planned, and every so often, someone notices a small slip of paper, neatly folded beneath the glass, a boarding pass marked 1E, faint ink fading with time. They ask what it is. The guides just say, a reminder of what of the day one man stayed still and the world, at last, learned to move. Malcolm Grant's story isn't just a lesson about racism or power. It's a reminder for all of us that dignity isn't something to be won, but something no one has the right to take away. When you're offended, you can choose to respond with anger or with wisdom. Anger may make people fear you, but wisdom and calmness will make them respect you forever. Malcolm didn't scream, didn't fight back, didn't retaliate. He let the facts speak for themselves, and that changed the entire airline industry. The 3C chair, a symbol of dignity flying with humanity, is now placed in the National Museum as a reminder. One man did not leave his chair, and the world began to move. Justice sometimes comes not from shouts, but from weighty silence. And if you believe that mutual respect is the foundation of any good society, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to spread stories of morality, justice, and dignity. Thank you for joining us, because if just one person maintains dignity, the whole world can change.